Welcome to the Collidescope podcast, where you can hear me, George Salis, reading some of my favorite stories by some of my favorite authors. This time, Alexander Theroux was generous enough to allow me to read one of the stories from his latest volume, Early Stories, published by Tough Poets Press in August 2021. In fact, if you want to hear how I helped Alex find a publisher for his stories, then be sure to listen to my guest appearance on Beyond the Zero podcast. I'll put a link in the description. The early stories were followed up with Alex's fables and will end with a volume of his later stories. Whether you love him or hate him, Alexander Theroux is a legendary writer. I consider Darkenville's Cat and Laura Warharlock to be his twin pillar masterpieces and encourage you to seek out my reviews of those novels on the Collidescope website. He doesn't pull any punches, so much so that his characters are often monstrous caricatures who elicit as much horror as humor. And yet there's always a human element at the core of things. When he isn't roasting racists, anti-intellectuals, and others, he's exploring the two largest themes, love and hate, and the elements of each that can be found in the other. I'll be reading the very first story in the volume, titled A Woman with Sauce, which describes the culinary standoff between a potential son-in-law and a potential mother-in-law from hell. If you're easily offended, then this episode is not for you. For all others, I hope you find this story as fun and funny as I do. In some ways, I think it's a microcosm of Theroux's oeuvre. So, without further ado, let's get to the story. A Woman with Sauce by Alexander Theroux. Mrs. Capitayupo might have been my mother-in-law. It was a fate I was spared. As to how touches directly upon the discovery I made of a certain secret of hers, which, in the course of things, nevertheless, lost me the fair maiden I rightly should have won. Discovery, secret, fair maiden, I realize these are the phrases of fairy tale. But fairy tales also have to do with ogres, haven't they? And she lived with her husband, a fish cutter, and one daughter. A son had moved away to California years ago, in one of those congested working-class cities on the outskirts of greater Boston, where in the steam heat of summer neighbors shouted, children raced noisy tricycles here and about, and Italian music blared from various windows. I remember thinking, upon my first visit, perhaps because of all that, how favored I was in having at last prevailed upon Angela to allow me the chance to meet her parents. Her inexplicable reluctance to do so had, for some time, frankly become inconsistent with the deeper feelings and larger but as yet unspoken intentions we had begun to hold for each other. She was blonde and vulnerable, only 19, and always wore 3 black rings, which habitually she twisted, looking up at any question of mine, any comment, with a gentle but wistful smile that more often than not substituted for, rather than accompanied, the few words, despite my encouragement to the contrary, she ever spoke. Her mountain blue eyes seemed always to look upon submerged dreams. She had fears I could never quite figure out. She reminded me of a lost child. I first met Angela in Kenmore Square, where nearby, going through a bit of a bad patch myself, loneliness, I was on a year visa doing postgraduate work at Boston University. She was walking desolately along a sidewalk. A dog had just snapped at her. This gave us conversation of a sort. My talk, her sad smiles. She kindly agreed to have a cup of coffee with me, and I continued to see her. We needed each other, I suppose. But how many afternoons, walking down quiet streets under the tall, slumbering trees along the length of sycamore-shaded waters of the Charles, had she to be prodded to speak of herself? I attributed this, until I knew better, less to my being English than to the 15-year age difference between us, a fact that, while I was aware of it, never unsettled me really until that moment we found ourselves walking up a back way to the second-floor flat of her house where, awkwardly, but finally, I was introduced to her parents. There are certain images we are never able to suppress. I shall never forget the first glimpse I had of her mother, a woman in big pig-pink hair papers and an old drabbit-like housecoat, caught unawares but suddenly hunching up and inward in defensive embarrassment, a little me pose impossible for her fatness, at the exact moment she was gulping down a gigantic forkful of spaghetti. A potful of it sat on the stove, from which I was helped out a bowl the size of my surprise, but impossible to finish. Sharing it, I imagine, made me an accomplice, for Angela's mother, with what seemed a scratch of annoyance, kept urging me on, in vain, with short forward jerks of her chin. "Don't he like it?" asked Mrs. Capitiupo of Angela, never directly addressing me, but become a pattern there, and looking slightly wounded. "It's delicious." "He likes it?" "Very much," I said, "and the sauce is lovely." "It's my own," she said to Angela. "It probably needs salt." It didn't. "Do you add something extra for flavor?" I asked. She answered nothing. I repeated my question. "Special ingredients?" "I don't know." She shrugged, looking off at a faraway wall, saying, "A little of this, a little of that." Whenever I visited Angela, as I did over the next few months, she and I sat talking in her bedroom where we were more or less confined. Her mother had commandeered the rest of the flat for herself, maintaining strict cubicular boundaries and keeping the furniture of the living and dining room shrouded in ghostly sheets all year round for the visitors, who were non-existent, and guests, I never qualified, who might want to enjoy the brothel red drapes, the hiccuping cuckoo clock, and the tasteful ceramic figurine of two cross-eyed Roman boys holding up a gilt lamp with fringed shade. And there was literally hell to pay if anyone dared trench upon the closed sanctity of those fusty rooms, which twice, unwittingly, I did, only to meet with the subtle if indirect reproval the second time that all that week she'd been finding dog hairs on the sofa. These rooms were hers. They described her. In fact, she used them infrequently herself, except when in one of her moods she characteristically moped in and huffily plumped herself down in an overstuffed chair, eating big dishes of peach ice cream and listening lugubriously to the old 78 RPM record she loved of out-of-date 1950s crooners with fruity voices and names like Al Martino and Don Cornell and, I don't know, Tony Candenza, that sort of thing. It was not long before I came to see Mrs. Capitiupo for what she was, a cross between Lucrezia Borgia and a case of smallpox. She never acknowledged me again whenever I appeared. She insisted that, while her husband asked me to call him Frank, I call her Mrs. Capitiupo. Her name, of course, but a title by possession she felt in the mastery better served. And while she boasted to know everything, she was in point of fact an irreconcilable illiterate who would have had difficulty reading anything other than the movie magazines and gruesome tabloids with full-page headlines she devoured. She once pointedly told Angela in my presence never to trust anyone not in the family. She said the opposite another time. She talked more absolute rot than I have ever heard in my life. I always wondered if she herself believed what she said. Her mouth was huge. Every time I saw it, I thought of an invasion barge with the gulping maw of a whalefish, wide and flat, filter-feeding anything in sight. There was a large photograph of herself that she kept hanging in the hallway, one of those darling, mal-colored 1940s facial arrangements with the subject finger to cheek. I wished for darts. During my visits, Frank was either at work or on the front porch watching television. He seemed always to have an air of disgruntled amusement about him, as though he were enjoying a sad private joke of some sort, the understanding, perhaps impossible to divulge, of having caught the irony of exactly what marriage was, and yet still stayed with it. His wife always avoided me. She stayed either in the kitchen noisily renewing friendship with her pots and pans, or kept to her bedroom, from the confines of which, usually around noon, often came a fake, broken-wing lameness of voice calling, "Angela, what time is it?" Or, "Get me an aspirin." Or, "Oh, you're still here." Meaning, of course, guess who? It became her habit, I soon found out, a matter of pride after our initial encounter, to have to wait for me to leave in order to eat, which she did constantly, stowing away double orders and smacking her lips for more. She ate the mutton, as they say in London, and dreamt of the wool. I fought an image of her upon my every departure, falling desperately upon a vast tableful of puddings and pies. I became, even if temporarily, her calorie counter. Mrs. Capitayupo was fat. It was proof of her selfishness, however, not her hunger. There was such a moon-desperate fullness to her face, recessing her eyes, that her nose and mouth looked like accidental inequalities on a large, swarthy sphere. She hadn't the trace of a waist. The effect was that of an enormous beetle, and had been on a diet for virtually 10 or 15 years, which she ever sought to broadcast after dispatching countless plates of pasta by ostentatiously sipping diet-free drinks. She suffered from heartburn, agata, as she called it, using the word as a medical explanation for her personal excess. She farted a lot. She wore ankle nylons and powdered her feet. She had years ago tried several jobs she had failed at, selling cosmetics, office filing, and the like, but was now bored utterly, and spent her days, when not shopping, in that cheerless, unlit box set of a kitchen, flipping through things like linoleum catalogs and complaining about her arthritis and making interminable food lists. "Let's see," she'd say, holding a pencil and dropping her head with a breath like a groan. "We need, what? Bread, potatoes, pie crust, gravy mix, lunch meat, Cheez-Its, bacon, oregano, a bag of apples. You like them macaroons?" No one had said a word. "And I want cream pie." Mrs. Capitayupo was what might be described as a giddy shopper, and in the process, spending a lot of money trying to cheer herself up, became the ultimate consumer. She bought diet candy, exotic soaps, charcoal water taps, Fruit Loops, electric brooms, cheese wheels, bun warmers, fish sticks, striped toothpastes, Mary Kay hand lotion, cod balls, turkeys with thermometers, and bottles of sal hepatica, which she kept with a spoon on her bedside to feed the pyromaniacal double, who arose howling every night to be quenched. She loved kitchen gadgets and had the glutton's interest in buying culinary, wafflers, egg separators, and flan pans, each of which she would use often only once in hysterical bouts of cooking, meals she ate which somehow gave no pleasure, but only left her body as an almost autoimmune system that didn't recognize itself, and yet of itself it was distinctly aware. The sole source of her busyness was her own well-being, her serenity, only as recent as her last meal, her satisfaction only as relevant as the next. She frankly wasn't old, about 55 or 56, but she acted it, humping around with the face of hypochondria and bushy slippers and dusted feet, and making everyone get up and out of the way as inspiredly she acted upon one of those rare but inexplicable fits of energy, during which, maniacally, she began vacuuming or pot-walloping dishes or straying about the flat trying to sophisticate the furniture. She bowled about and threw things and grizzled. She was always angry when she was hungry, and she was hungry all the time. Inconsistent, intemperate, and ill-tempered, she browbeat her husband with questions, the worst form of nagging. Frank, of course, found his life with her a continuous struggle. His marriage took the form of regret. He never thought of one without the other. Tired, afflicted, and disturbed, he simply opted out. He ate alone, kept to himself, and because he had to get up at 5 a.m. for work, slept alone, which in his mind became a blessing to be filed under the law of unintended consequences. The two of them fought all the time. They would argue about nothing, just to keep their hand in. I would drive over to the house and, knowing better than to inquire, in fact not needing to, Angela only shook her head sadly, instantly smelled trouble by the sulphurous silence that prevailed in those rooms. But silence was the exception. Mrs. Capdeau to that, who, whining and shouting, was a fly who always had an appointment in somebody's ointment. Noise was the country of which she was sole ambassador, except of course when she was having one of her black dogs, cloudy, malignant depressions which were real sulks, and then it was either off to the bedroom or behind a door banged shut upon the regal privy from which always came the sound of a loud, furious flush. She spent more time in the biffy than the float ball. Angela was virtually a prisoner there. It broke my heart. It was bad for her, and it had a bad effect on I was going to write relationship. What I suppose we had between us was an alliance against a common enemy. This became the source of unspoken unity in a way, but whenever I pleaded with her to assert herself, she froze, quietly weeping at the hopelessness of the situation and oddly placing me in the position of bully myself. She was so kind and lovely and desperate to be happy. Happy people laugh a lot, so she would laugh whenever she could, and often when she should not. She deserved so much more than she was given. I could often see complaint building in her soft blue eyes, however, as time passed. She seemed always arranged in an attitude of contrition. Her diffidence often literally immobilized her. She once told me her mother always made her feel bad about herself. She had hated school and had no education, no job, and almost no money, the combination of which gave her mother further leverage in making Angela her slave, a dog's body to wash up after dinner, someone to follow about everywhere, bleeding disapproval. Anything her mother disliked or disapproved of, she met with a great, bulge-headed, belly-bumping refusal, which was reinforced by a spate of lies and anti-logic and contradiction. I came to see that Angela had a terrible separation anxiety, a dreadful fear of a life independent of this woman who for so long had forced her into a state of woeful dependence by robbing her of any chance for a life of her own, which the poor child nevertheless chose to interpret as a condition of her parents' incapacities, requiring of her the role of self-appointed agent to keep the family together. It was a tragic error. She couldn't have been more wrong. The only good word Mrs. Capodiupo ever had was for this one son of hers who had gone away, and about whom, citing his absolute genius in playing the accordion when he was a boy, she talked incessantly. "When he done Lady of Spain," she constantly repeated, "they come up to hear from the downstairs apartment." This was pure revisionism, of course. She had sorely bullied him, which is why he had left, as she bullied everyone, especially Angela, pushing and pulling and ordering her about like the big malicious dyke she so perfectly resembled. A bully because she was a coward, and she kept her daughter in servitude and her husband in thrall as a way of serving notice to the fears of loneliness she herself faced for all she was. She robbed her husband of whatever position he took, that is, whenever he took one. Once he had complained of a hospital fee attendant upon his wife's curiously still unverifiable case of arthritis, and was immediately met with a firestorm of remonstrance. "They ain't failures, Frank. Them doctors earn more money than you," she howled. "They should know more. Look at them hands of yours, cracked red. Fish poisons. But you know everything, right? Right?" She slammed shut her ironing board. "Boning out card." She robbed Angela of confidence as well. She diminished her. One Mother's Day, for instance, Angela had boxed and wrapped a vase as a gift, which early that morning she set out on the table. That evening she found it back in her room, refused. She hadn't spent enough money. Gratitude there was expensive. It was the same with the gold locket Angela had given her for her birthday when her mother picked it up, revolved it in her chubby fingers, paused, and then squawked, "It don't open, though." It did not open, and Angela was crushed. She grew sadly silent, which seemed saucy to her mother, who, accusing her of ingratitude, stood up and marched into the bog, flushing the toilet, and then went vanishing, svanerando, into that cloister of spite and refusal she called her bedroom, to slam the door and stay for days. No one is more stubborn than a stupid person. What I put up with from her mother, nevertheless, curiously told me how much I cared for Angela, and yet, ironically, I seemed to countenance what I had to ignore. In matters of love, it is easier to stifle a feeling than to lose a habit. I wanted Angela for all I felt she needed of me and the society of ghosts that haunted her. But as the poor thing had no defenses against her mother, I knew she would never be mine. There seemed sadly a mutual acceptance of it. We had nothing in common except love. It was hopeless. It wouldn't be quite the truth now to say that Mrs. Capodiupo had no weak spots, or better, no weak spots that weren't soft. She had one. It had to do with her spaghetti sauce. Compliments on that subject alone softened her. Her face upon any word of flattery or approbation on that score congealing upon the instant into an expression of the most fatuous piety. She constantly protested it wasn't tasty enough, or rich enough, or zesty enough, expecting only to hear, and repeatedly, it was. And she grew smugger with each apology. Oddly enough, she could not cook very well, but she made a real dog and pony show with her sauce, which came in a variety of ways: bolognese, amatriciana, salsa smeraldo. She always made her sauce from scratch, and had seen the practice of that ideal die out, with malicious glee, I might add, for it gave her one distinction. Now, if it is generally accepted that professional chefs are generous with recipes, it is also commonly understood that housewives are famously not. Not at all. In this particular case, however, it became comic. I particularly remember one intricate salsa alla funghi that Mrs. Capitayupa served. I saw the mushrooms, and recall offhandedly asking her how she made it several times. It was extraordinary. She spoke vaguely, never mentioning ingredients, of pinches and dashes. That was it. But pinches and dashes of exactly what? Basil? She said nothing. A bit of rosemary? She folded her hands and gave me a kind of in-the-pocket smile. Frank grabbed the newspaper and left for the porch. I taste a spice of some kind, I lilted my voice playfully. Pesto? Ground something? Her face palled. I should have let the matter drop, but I felt game. It was harmless. Wine? Garlic? Pinoli nuts? Try as she might, Angela could not repress a smile. On the instant, however, Mrs. Capitayupo looked immediately vexed and glared at her from across the room as a blush swept up her daughter's face. She lowered her eyes. There was a long pause. I couldn't believe it. I realized for the first time Mrs. Capitayupo took herself to be in possession of a deep, dark secret, a bit of huggery-muggery all her own and remedially concealed from anyone who, by finding out, could only compete with her. She didn't want me to marry Angela, that was hardly a secret, but no one was going to get the leg up on her with this secret ingredient. I honestly couldn't decide whether it was disgusting or comical the way she sat back at the end of each such meal over the next few weeks, a huge, mustachioed god-for-god shaking out her housecoat and nailing me with a kind of fat-witted satisfaction that tacitly told me that, although I ate her sauce, I would learn absolutely nothing about it. Serving her sauce was actually her way of keeping it from you, and what seemed to be generosity was in fact only parsimony, a kind of avarice. It was an indictment, the offering that blames, the kindness that accuses. That was when our relationship, Mrs. Capitayupo's and mine, really began. Whereas at first I had resolved to avoid rather than taunt her stupidity, I decided now I would either learn her secret or burst. It became a contest. I prodded Angela, of course, who had surely been told this secret, but she was one of those high-principled and literal people in whom guilt, not to say loyalty, held irrational sway. With no courage, she was petrified of her mother's wrath, and she wouldn't betray a trust, no matter how foolish or trivial. There were, of course, cookbooks. Over the weeks, I fawned through more than a few at the BU library and fumbled up the stock preparations and combinations available to anyone who can read, choices of cheese, minces, and measurements, and was almost able to taste the recipes I read, but always without the full and final satisfaction of knowing with certainty the one special ingredient passed to her mother from her mother, whose own mother used it a century ago in the little town of Avellino, which Angela, twisting her rings, eventually dared suggest was missing from the poor lists I had begun repeatedly and tediously reviewing on our long walks and after the movies and over the telephone. Meanwhile, Mrs. Capitayupo had grown suspicious, not that I gave a toss. My simplest inquiries about anything became the occasion of her mistrust, and whenever I was around, she put the monkey up. She began listening for footsteps. She pulled tricks, even. For example, expressing a need to go shopping, she once, for no particular reason, mentioned that she needed some ribbon, a chafing dish, and, much too loudly, gorgonzola cheese. I looked up alert, only to see her peering around the corner at me like a great buttered seal. And several times she left out the sugar bullet specifically to tease me. I'm certain of it. But really, that was a hint? The little touch of agrodolce? My reading hadn't been in vain. No, Mrs. Potato Head, nothing new there, sorry. Neither the cheese, nor the cold rifatto I saw her slicing up that one time I inadvertently blundered into the kitchen, when violently she sprang up like Minerva, holding forth her breadboard like a shield in front of her lips unable to close, as if that putty ball nose, white in surprise, were pulling the top one open and suppressing the command her terrible humid eyes nevertheless wordlessly burnt into Angela. "Get him out!" I thought once that I came close. About that time I had to pick her up shopping one night, but could not manage to find her in that local mall to which habitually, operatically, she set out, all perfumed and rouged, with her big handbag for hours of recreational shopping. She looked even homelier dressed up, the monkey in the tuxedo. Mrs. Capitayupo, as I say, liked at times to go out. She bowled sometimes. She adored functions. But recreational shopping for her was tops. Anyway, the next half hour or so, Angela and I traipsed through all the supermarkets she favored, and which, in American, rich coincidence, all have names like movie monsters, Caldor, Osco, Zare, Supergiant, Foodmaster, etc. And just after we split up to make it easier, I found her. I followed Mrs. Capitayupo at a suitable distance, like a comic stage detective, and went scuttling into pet food, past sundries, whatever they are, and round a corner. I could see her price-comparing jars of olive oil, shaking bags of crisps, rolling pears around in her testing paws like a hungry agouti of Brazilian nut. And then she spotted me. It happened in aisle 3, where she was swiftly redepositing on the shelf several cans of tomato paste and pointlessly disclaiming ownership out of sheer perversity the filled pushcart by her elbow that I quickly, madly studied, and from which, mock innocently, I lifted up to examine some ribbon, a knob of gorgonzola, and a chafing dish. "Them ain't mine," she said, her eyes narrowing like flints, her high voice nasal, and having something in it like the quality of string on a tightly tied package when plucked. "Them are someone else's." And, shaking her head, she went wobbling away down the aisle. That was the extent of it. And so, what finally do I discover? Nothing. The ashes of emptiness. J'avais la vie. Well, that's not strictly true. Over the next fortnight, I made some headway on my list by concentrating on what I had and breaking the preparation down now to fats and then to vegetables, which gave me a profitable return in what I sought of moistenings and flavorings, and then by using a sort of backdoor approach, absence being a kind of presence, I began logically to deduce what was missing by what at her table, in her cabinets, and on her counter I realized I never saw, which gave me carrots and shallots and garlic, and the chicken fat I had like a dimwit overlooked. The button mushrooms I easily wangled one night out of Angela, who had a particular laugh that always meant yes. And only a dunce couldn't discern the taste of bouquet garni. A formula thus emerged. I thought the addition, never mind the taste, of tomato paste slightly shabby and unprofessional, but the final tally looked formidable. 1 pound beef, 1 large onion, shallots, stick celery, bay leaves, 8 fluid ounces, 1 cup milk, 8 fluid ounces, 1 cup red Chianti, 1/2 ounces tomato paste, 3 ounces butter, 1 or 2 carrots, 1/4 pound mushrooms, 8 fluid ounces water or clear soup, 1 tablespoon basil, 1/4 cup chicken fat, 2 cans tomato sauce, bouquet garni to taste, a bit of flour, a bit of sugar. Something yet was missing. I knew it. I knew it. I incontrovertibly knew it, as much from inner conviction as from the sweetness of Angela's wistful face and those soft eyes as blue as indigo when she would glance furtively, quickly, at my gat-toothed column of ingredients with a silent lack of encouragement. But she wouldn't betray her mother. I both pitied her and loved her for it. Of what it pointed to in the future, I had stopped thinking. It was something I knew I could do nothing about, and I was discouraged enough. I was not looking for a tried and true recipe, remember? Not simply a sufficient sugo to accompany spaghetti. I was seeking the secret to it. But after a while, blunting my talents on invisible difficulties and shaping them around mysteries that never yielded, lost its novelty. Nothing would answer. It was a washout. I gave up. The Christmas holidays came and went, with the Capatayupos eating meals of such 5-square proportions, great lashings of pasta, popovers, bowls of tortellini, piselli, and what not, that when it was over, there wasn't a sardine left to lie down on the canapé. And so depressed, so disgusted at everything and everyone around her was Mrs. Capatayupo for putting on weight that she dropped the housework, filed into her bedroom, and petulantly refused to come out. A strange peacefulness prevailed in consequence, and the woman snored away the days. She rolled over this way one week, on another that. Her sudden reappearance, sometimes as late as February, always resembled the dehibernation of a scowling grizzly, ravenous and blinking cantankerously through a riddle of daylight. My visits became less and less frequent, and yet one late winter afternoon, my stopping by to see Angela, we were having coffee in the kitchen, happened to coincide with the famous moment next to which, I swear, the raising of Lazarus was an egg over easy. The bedcasters groaned. The floor thumped. There was the sound of shuffling slippers. I looked up astonished to see a great pop-faced olio, bigger than Boston, squinting and staggering forward in that moth-eaten housecoat 1 step at a time, and looking more melancholy than a woodpecker in a petrified forest. Mrs. Capatayupo was bloated and had even lost the uniform sense of a head. She grew immediately cross, throwing dishes and hurling insults, and lit into Angela, who sat there trying weakly to smile at me, but utterly humiliated and cowering under the torrent of abuse which so overwhelmed me in its sudden brutality that I was not prepared for what followed. I gasped, I tell you, unbelieving, as Mrs. Capatayupo, lumbering toward the refrigerator, yanked it open and took out a Tupperware bowl of spaghetti sauce. I was listening within me to the whisper of a revelation, one not yet formed, as I watched her crowd forward into the table with eyes small and pig-like, and begin spooning up the stuff with such ravenous lack of appeasement that the snuffling plosives it sent through her nose made it sound, I promise, like she was beginning to inflate. The whisper within me grew louder. And then the penny dropped. I realized that I had looked everywhere but right in front of me. Noting merely details, I had missed the whole. Do we gain in repose what we've lost in intensity? For I suddenly saw what for so long I hadn't accepted, the understanding that a certain length of time is as necessary to discover the truth as it is for a portraitist to capture his subject. And instantly I knew I had my sauce when I saw I had my subject. It was simplicity itself. I had found the secret ingredient. But I had lost something else, and I knew it. For over that same length of time came another understanding, that while we feel in one world, we undeniably think and name in another, and between the two set up dreams that in the division can only dim. A sad truth to have to admit. It was even sadder to realize as I watched that poor girl shrinking into herself, growing smaller and smaller, that what was taken away was perhaps never even given, was never allowed, was stolen. Curiously, when love is lost, we suddenly seek less to know our pain than to show the most appropriate image of it to the person who caused it. But of course it was not Angela who caused anything. I sat there watching Mrs. Capitayupo in the full and constant image she showed me, swilling her sauce, and in seeing the way she had abandoned that child and so deliberately owning her, saw also die that dawn whose blushes her young face so briefly reflected, finding in its stead only a lost and tragic life left for her in the profound darkness that remained. Like desire, regret seeks not understanding, but satisfaction. Without being asked, I helped myself to a bowl of spaghetti sauce, savored the taste, and again made my usual wide inquiries as to what was missing. I dissembled. Was it breadcrumbs? Some special kind of stock, maybe? Red mullet? How about peppers? But there came no answer, none at all. Mrs. Capitayupo, folding her hands, fixed me with a hateful smile, and continued simply regarding me in a cold silence, warming to self-satisfaction that finally had too much smugness in it for me not to try. The pause was delicious. One more word. I said, pork. There must have been a world of meaning there, for before I knew it, Mrs. Capitayupo flew into the bathroom and slammed the door ringing shut, whence came the sound of a loud flushing toilet, which was always the sign that reigned most supremely in her kingdom of disapproval. And yet, disapproval this time was final. I never saw Angela again. There you have it. I hope you saw and delighted in the light-heartedness found in the dark heart of this story. And I encourage you to purchase the 2 volumes that are currently available from Tough Poets Press. This press is one of my absolute favorites, run by the heroic Rick Schober, who breathes life into neglected literature, a mission that is shared by me at the Collidescope, especially with my monthly column, Invisible Books. Speaking of which, you can find a plethora of text interviews, reviews, as well as fiction and poetry in general at my website, thekaleidoscope.com. If you want to contribute to my efforts monetarily, you can show support via patreon.com/thekaleidoscope, where you can get early access to content like this, as well as other awesome benefits, such as editorial services and even monthly invisible book picks sent to your mailbox. Even if you just share this podcast on social media, you'll be doing a lot to make the unheard heard. So thanks so much for listening, and stay tuned because there's always more content in the works.